second eAcademy session today, and we are very, very, very pleased to have with us David Lang, who does so many things behind the scenes and not only teaches, but really is one of the key authors of this timeline that you're going to see the first look at today. It differs, and I'll let him go into the difference between the old timeline and the new timeline. And when it's going to be released. And somebody's already asked, are we going to have a special offering on it? Yes, we will, and that's not too far off. But I do want to let you know that most of you know we have a question area in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you have a question, go ahead and type that in, and we'll try to answer them as we go. And then if we have specific questions for David at the end, we will ask him. The other thing is that in the chat room, Linda is put in there for people that attend the, only people that come to the academies do we have a special bonus coupon. Many of you are aware of it. It's a 25% off coupon that you can use on any item within our store, even upgrades on collections. It does not apply to cross-grades, crossovers, or anything that's currently on sale. But I can tell you that when we have the timeline on sale, it will be more discounted than the 25% off. So the 25% coupon there in the chat area is for anything you want during this time. So take advantage of that. It's a one-time use. So it will expire Monday night, the 29th at midnight. So you can just start putting stuff if you do desire to in your cart and then check out and you'll get 25% off. So now let's begin the recording. We welcome you again to a first look at the brand new Accordance Timeline Expanded Edition. And the creator and the instructor today is David Lang. David, take it over.
All right. Well, I feel a little bit like a kid at Christmas time, or I guess more like the gift giver at Christmas time. I'm really excited to be able to unveil this for the first time. Been working on it for a long time, and it's been sort of on the back burner for even longer than I've been working on it. So we're unveiling today a new major upgrade to the timeline, and I'm going to start by kind of going over the original timeline. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, and even for those of you who have it, you may discover some features that you didn't even realize you had access to. And then I'm going to switch out the new timeline that I've been working on, and you'll see more than three times the number of items, and there's a lot more to it, and then we'll kind of dig into it. But before we do that, I want to kind of orient you to the timeline to begin with. And I've got I made a little user tool, and apparently GoToMeeting won't let us share accordance files. So I just printed out a PDF from this user tool that you should be able to get in the handout section. But this is just kind of a real basic overview of the way to think of the timeline, understanding the rationale behind the different regions and items, and then talking about the new timeline. So it'll give you something to have to look over. And I'm also going to turn off my camera now that you've seen my smiling face, because this ought to give you more room where you can see the screen better. All right, so this is the timeline as it currently exists. You'll see some things that are a little different because I've already installed a new timeline, and some of that's going to show up. But this is zoomed out so that you can see the entire timeline. And the way I want you to think of the timeline is, think of it as a tapestry. And the way that we have developed the timeline is we've divided history geographically. So we've got all of these different regions And we've plotted the history of each region so that you can make comparisons. So we have Egypt, Israel, this is Aram, Syria, modern-day Syria, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, Persia, modern-day Iran. This is Asia, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, Greece, and then Rome. And this thin little stripe up here is a world history section that we added years ago with the intention of adding world history kinds of items, but we could never really figure out how to do it, and just didn't have the time to do it. And so it's been sitting there as a kind of vestigial region all this time. And so those are the regions that are currently available on the timeline that you may have if you've got one of our packages that includes the timeline, or you've bought the timeline yourself. And the thing that makes the timeline unique is that what we've done is we've assigned each region a color. So when the people of one region dominate the people of another region, you'll see that region's color spill out onto those other regions. So if I zoom in here, and you can zoom in on the timeline just by dragging a box and then double clicking inside the box. And now we've zoomed in a little bit and we can see, all right, well, here's the late Assyrian Empire. And if I want more information about an item, I just click on it. I get its dates, I get its name, and if there's scripture references associated with it, I get the scripture references. And so here we've got the late Assyrian Empire expanding and conquering Phoenicia, conquering the nation of Aram, and then conquering Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, but stopping with Judah. And you can see here in the divided monarchy period of Israel's history, we've got this one region, Israel-Palestine, divided into two subregions. We actually have the capability to have as many as 4 different subregions, although we didn't really use all 4 in the original timeline. But you'll see that we are using more of the subregions in the new timeline. All right, so so you've got these colors that sort of show you the ebb and the flow of the different empires. So here's Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire eventually conquers Judah. The purple for Persia is the Persian Empire, so they expand and go all the way down into Egypt, conquer Egypt for a while, then are overthrown briefly, and then conquer Egypt again, before you have this little thin stripe that goes all the way up to Greece, and that's Alexander the Great. So you get the idea. That's the tapestry of history that we're trying to paint with the timeline. And then you can explore the threads of that tapestry in more detail, just like I showed you when I clicked on that item. Let's do this. One thing to be aware of is that you can simplify this tapestry because there's so much information already. It can be kind of hard to see everything that's going on. And you can see right now, I have all items displayed, and the different items that we have available on the original timeline are rulers, prophets, individuals, writings, and events. Religious leaders is a new one that's been added with the new timeline. So in that PDF that I've shared with you, I kind of explain the rationale behind the items. So rulers plot the length of a ruler's reign, and prophets is the period of a particular prophet's ministry, and then individuals is the length of an individual's life. Writings is the date when a literary work was written, and events are the date of a particular event, like a battle or a journey or a decree or a movement or whatever. And to examine one of these threads in detail, let's go down to the area of David. And I want to show you the difference between the different items. Here we have David actually appear twice. You have David's life from 1041 to 971, and notice it's the green of an individual. So this is David as an individual. It gives his lifespan. Then we have David as a ruler, which gives the length of his reign. And so you can actually compare the two items. How old was David when he became king in Israel? Well, we can explore that by holding down the Option key and dragging from the beginning of his life to the beginning of his reign, and you'll see the years are added up in the instant details box and also up here. So we should get an age of around 30 years old, right? So you can make comparisons like that. You can explore the events in David's life. So these are all the events in red, and so on. So to get more information, I can click on an item, and here I get David life, the name of the item. I get the time span of his life, and then I get the relevant scripture references. All right, so all of this is available in the current timeline. One other feature that you may not be aware of with the current timeline, so if we think of the timeline as a tapestry, clicking on any particular item is like taking a magnifying glass and going up to the tapestry and examining one particular horizontal thread of the tapestry in detail. We can also explore the vertical threads of the tapestry. Now, the vertical threads are the years that are being, counted, that are passing along this date bar here. And if I want to find out, well, what's going on in 1000 BC, I can click on the date bar and I will get this little timeline data window that, let's just look at this in more detail, that will show me everything that's happening on the timeline at this particular time. So in 1000 BC, this is what is currently displayed on the timeline. You've got the world region, which is blank. Nothing's going on in Rome and Italy. In Greece, you're in the Dark Age. In Asia Minor, you have Neo-Hittite states. These are states that were kind of picking up the pieces of the fallen Hittite Empire. In Persia, nothing's listed there. If I had done a range of years, I think you'd see something there. Mesopotamia, Assyria is in decline. Aram is struggling with the Philistines, and then you have the events of David's reign in 1000 BC. And in Egypt, you're in the third intermediate period. So you have this nice little summary report that shows you, if you know enough about the events that you're looking at, that David is able to expand his little empire precisely because all of the other major empires have collapsed and there's a power vacuum that David is starting to fill. So because I happen to know about this Dark Age and about the Hittite Empire that preceded these Neo-Hittite states and so on, this report is meaningful to me. It gives me a nice little snapshot of that one point in time. The problem is, if you're not familiar with these events, this report doesn't really help you that much. Ionian city-states in Anatolia, what is that? Well, if I'm not familiar with the history, Ionian city-states doesn't tell me that much, right? So the timeline data report is there in the current timeline, but it definitely can be improved. And the exciting thing is that it has been improved. So I'm going to show you some of the changes to the timeline. But before I do that, I want to show you one other thing that is that's new, and it's a change in accordance that you can benefit from even now if you have the current timeline. By the way, I'm putting the finishing touches on the new upgrade. We're testing installers, and once we get all that done, then we should be releasing in the next week or two, I hope. So so you won't have to wait long for the timeline, for the new timeline. But in the meantime, you've got a new toy that you can play with if you update to 13.1, which is the latest update to Accordance 13. And I'll just close the timeline for now and open up the biblical text. And I'm going to open up, yeah, let's do it this way. I'm going to open up the info pane, and I'm going to go to 2 Samuel 11. All right, I was joking. Anybody that's seen me do a timeline webinar knows that I love 2 Samuel 11. This is the story of David and Bathsheba. And you can see in the info pane, you've got all of these topics associated with the current verse at the top of the window. And if you go down under the topics, you'll also see timeline. Now, prior to 13.1, it would show you any item that actually had the name, where the name of that item was in the verse. So, and actually I think it was if the name happened to be in our topics database. So, so you would see perhaps David, maybe you'd see Joab, but now you see a lot more items on the timeline associated with this particular passage. And the reason that you see more now is because Accordance is now searching the scripture references in the timeline for any items that refer to this particular passage. So you're going to get a lot more information about a passage as you scroll through. Okay, so let's just click on David's adultery with Bathsheba here, and we'll zoom in here and notice it found David's adultery with Bathsheba. And so it's found that based on the fact that 2 Samuel 11 is cited here in the info for David's adultery with Bathsheba. So you're going to find a lot more items from the timeline, on the timeline from Scripture. Or let's do it another way. Let's do, let's try doing a search for Ahab. And yeah, let's go to First Kings 18. All right, and so here, this is the showdown between Elijah and Ahab. And so now the timeline based on the scripture is bringing up Ahab, Elijah, Joash, who was the king of Judah at the time. It's the 3-year drought that precedes this showdown on Mount Carmel. The writings, that these are the books that this passage is included in, and so on. I could click on one of these, or I can just select the verse reference and amplify to the timeline. And it will find me everything on the timeline that that has that particular scripture reference. So here we have the 3-year drought, Elijah, Ahab, and we should see Joash down in, well, maybe not, because we selected 18:1. What do we have for Joash there? Yeah, so it doesn't have 1 Kings 18. He's not mentioned in 1 Kings 18, so it doesn't come up with him. All right, so that's something that you can play around with right now. So already with Accordance 13.1 and the current timeline, you can have greater access to the timeline from the scripture references and from the info pane. All right, so what I'm going to do right now, one of the things that now that we've talked about the different items, all of these different items, one of the things that I want you to be aware of is that obviously, I can't zoom out very far without everything getting really tiny because there's so much information on the timeline. That's why we allow you to choose the items that appear on the timeline. So I can choose rulers, for example, and that gives me a much simpler timeline. Now notice that the items that are not rulers, but that I found with my previous search, still appear on the timeline. But other than that, the only thing that's displayed on the timeline is the rulers. And so everything gets a little smaller and easier to follow than when I have everything on the timeline. So I've got rulers. The other thing that you can do is you can choose different regions that you want to appear. So if I do, let's do Israel and Mesopotamia, because right now Israel is here down toward the bottom. We have Egypt, Israel, and then Mesopotamia is separated from Israel by Syria. But if I want to be able to compare, well, who is the Assyrian emperor who is active at the time of a particular Israelite king, I can just say, well, I want those two regions. And now I've got a much simpler timeline. I'm not seeing Rome and Greece and all of that. So you have the ability to create layers that will show you particular sets of regions and particular sets of items. And this is another thing that we're going to improve with the new timeline. And this is really a setting kind of thing. We bundle with the timeline a particular group of settings, and so we define region layers that we think will be helpful. Well, what I've done is I've gone in and I've redone all of those for the new timeline, hopefully to make these a lot more helpful to you. And the same with here. So I've got things like rulers, individuals, and events, prophets, priests, and kings. That'll have the religious leaders and so on. So it should be easier to use right out of the box. But I'll talk more about that in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to go back to all regions, and I've got rulers displayed. So I'm going to zoom out so that we can see pretty much the whole panorama that we have available right now. The current timeline covers Egypt to Rome and basically covers from around 3000 BC to around 600 AD. So a little bit into the Byzantine Empire, a little bit into the Sasanian Empire, but nothing really beyond that. All right, so that's what's available right now, and you've got about 1,000 different items that are in the current timeline. Now, what I'm going to do is quit accordance here, and I am going to, you're not going to have to do this, but I have to do this at this point. I'm going to drag my new time data in here and replace the old one. And when I launch accordance again, you should see a much larger timeline. All right, so let's just zoom in on this, and let me zoom out a little bit. All right, so this is how much we have for the new timeline. And the old timeline covered, let's see, Rome to about 600 AD, right? So the new timeline, or the old timeline covered, sorry, my hand's hitting the keyboard. The old timeline covered all of this. The new timeline brings everything up to the present day and adds really the rest of the world. So all of this is now available Plus, there's additional information in here, and we now have, like I said, over 3,000 items, more than 3 times the information that we had in the original timeline. All right, so let's just do something even less than rulers. Let's do prophets. And let's just zoom in on this, and let's look at the different regions. So we still have the same regions, but we've added 5 more. 4 more plus the world region that we had but never were really utilizing. We have Africa, so that's at the bottom. And within, remember how I told you that you can divide a region into subregions. So here I've got 2 subregions for Israel and Judah. Well, in these extra regions that we've added, I've been more liberal in my use of subregions. So in Africa, we've got basically sub-Saharan Africa, and then this is Carthage to Morocco, basically, and then this is Libya, and then that kind of eases into Egypt and so on. As we go a little further, it gets split 4 ways. So once Morocco kind of becomes separate from the region that was the Roman province of Africa, Morocco gets treated separately. So we've divided Africa into these 4 major subregions. And well, I'll talk about that in a second. Let's go to the next region. So then we have Arabia. We added Arabia to enable us to cover Islamic history. And you can see prior to the rise of Islam, you have Arabia divided into the Nabatean and Ghassanid kingdoms on the sort of northwestern edge of Arabia, which is best known to history. And then you have essentially the Maghreb, the area where Islam rose up, and then down in the south around Yemen, modern day Yemen. And then we have Mesopotamia, Persia, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. Rome now says Rome/Italy. So once we get beyond the Roman Empire and Italy kind of splits to pieces, you have 4 different subregions. So you have basically going from south to north. So you have the southern tip of the boot, which is kind of independent from the area that becomes controlled by the Byzantines and then becomes the Papal States. And then going up to the northeast part of Italy, you have Venice, which is kind of its own independent entity for a lot of Italian history. And then finally you get into northern Italy, which for a lot of the period is part of the Holy Roman Empire. And then we go to Eastern Europe, and we've divided that. So roughly going east to west. So the bottom of Eastern Europe is the Russian steppe, and then we go to the Balkans. Essentially, just north of the Balkans, Bulgaria, well, actually Hungary. Bulgaria is kind of interesting because it starts out north of the Danube, but the modern nation of Bulgaria is south of the Danube. So this is essentially split at the Danube. And then we have essentially Poland, northeastern Europe. And then for Western Europe, we have going from bottom to top, Germany, France, Spain, and Britain. And then with the world, we've basically got, everything that's left. So we have the Americas, North and South America, and then Oceania, which is basically Australia and the Pacific Islands, and then East Asia, so China, Japan, etc., and then finally India at the top. And so you can basically go around the world, and you should have a place where we can add each item that is could be added to the timeline. So obviously, the we kind of had to draw the line as far as how granular do you get with dividing the world into regions, and of course we only had 4 subregions per region, so that kind of limited our the number of divisions that we could make. So as I explain in this this document here, when I talk about the new regions, basically, we can't account for every different country that's got its own distinct history. And so what we tried to do was basically divide regions into subregions according to the largest or most dominant entity in that region. So, we basically did a broad stroke subregion for Britain. So Scottish history, Irish history, English history are all going to be in that section. Under Germany, we've got Germany, but there's also the Netherlands and other nations that are around there, and we don't have a separate Netherlands region. It's folded into Germany and so on. I know that may not make everybody happy. Somebody who's Irish may say, we're a completely different entity. I don't want to be, I want my own turf or something like that. But we basically, had to draw the line somewhere. But you should have a place where if you look and you say, hey, they didn't include this key event in my nation's history, you should have a logical place where you can put that on the timeline. And that was our goal. All right, so those are the regions that we have available. And let's see, let me talk about the new item that's available. So we've added, in addition to all of these regions, and notice we've got a bunch of predefined region layers. So you can, say, well, I want, let's do Europe. And if I do Europe, that's going to give me Greece, Rome, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. And so I've narrowed the timeline down a little bit, so on. But we've got a lot of these region layers predefined so that you don't have to worry about defining them yourself. And then we also have predefined items. And let me go ahead and just do religious leaders. And so for religious leaders, this is the new item that we added. And we added this because we added a bunch of religious leaders' terms in office. So popes, patriarchs of Constantinople, archbishops of Canterbury, other bishops, rabbis, and other religious leaders. And so we needed a way to, we couldn't just put them as individuals because the period of their life may not be well known, but the period of their ministry is. And we didn't think it was quite appropriate to fold all of those under the prophets item, so we created a separate item for religious leaders. And you can see here, let's do, all right, here we're in the Papal States, and This is around 1200 to 1400. And so we have all of the different popes that that served, and even anti-popes and so on. And you'll notice there's a big gap in here in the popes. And the reason for that is because this is the period of the Avignon papacy. This is actually the Pisan papacy, which was the third group of popes that got established after, I can't remember which council it was, but there was a council that excommunicated both warring popes and then elected a third one, and nobody recognized any of them, and nobody unanimously recognized any of them, and so on, until the Council of Constance that resolved the issue. But here, if we go up to France, now we've got all of the Avignon popes. So I can click on an item, and notice this is something that's new. Can I get that any bigger? I can't get the text bigger here. We've got a little issue with the icon here. But notice that now, in addition to the name of the item and the dates of the item, and if this were a biblical event, it would also give the scripture reference. We have a description of the item. So this tells me this is a pope in Avignon during the first outbreak of the Black Death. So at least I have something to orient me to what's going on in with this particular item. And that makes the timeline data report more useful too. If I click on this little icon here, remember previously you could click in the date bar for that timeline data report, but that was kind of a hidden feature, right? I suspect many of you may not ever have discovered that you could click in the date bar for that information. So another improvement that we've made is that we've added this little report button to the actual item description box that comes up when you click an item. And so now you can just click that button and it'll take the years of the item, so 1342 to 1352, and tell me everything that's going on the timeline that I have currently displayed, all for that particular time period. So this says timeline data, 1342 to 1352. This is what's going on in the Americas, Oceania, East Asia, and medieval India. And then Western Europe, you have the Holy Roman Empire. Now this is actually a little bug we've got to fix. The religious leaders should be appearing beneath the region they belong to, and they're appearing above. But so here are the Avignon popes for that particular period that intersect with those years that I selected. So basically it's the Pope before and the Pope after. And then this is what's going on in France. This is what's going on in Spain. You're in the Reconquista. And then you've got the Archbishops of Canterbury in England and so on. So now the timeline data report becomes much more useful because I can read about each of these items and get an idea of what's going on. All right. So, and that's just with the religious leaders displayed. If I had all items displayed, let's go ahead and do that. And how to get to France. All right, so if I click on, I think it was Clement VI, if I do this now with all items displayed, now I get a lot more information. So under the Holy Roman Empire, during this period, John Tauler is active in Germany. These are the Avignon popes. This talks about the Avignon Papacy. This is during the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Crécy is a battle in the 100 Years' War. This is these are the kings of France that are ruling at the time. This is what's going on in Spain, and on and on and on. So you get a snapshot of what's going on in the world at that particular time. All right, let me stop there and give you all a chance to ask some questions, and then I'll keep going. But I've shown you a lot. I don't want to show you so much that if you have questions, you forget them. So are there any questions?
I don't see any right now, David, but if
Okay.
anybody has any, oh wait, actually, here's one or two coming in. Are the subregions able to be user defined?
No, the subregions are not, but you can create an item and put it into the subregion that you want. So, for example, let's say that I want to add something to Spain. All right. So we've got in Europe, in the Europe region, we've got Germany. That's they're numbered from bottom to top. So this is subregion number 1. Number 2 is France. Number 3 is Spain. And number 4 is England. So let's say that you're Portuguese and you want to record events in Portuguese history. I have a few events in Portuguese history, but you know, let's say that you've got specific things that you want to add to that particular region. You can go under items and go to define user items, and you can create a new item and give it a name. And then when you, let's say it's a ruler of Portugal, so you would choose rulers, then you would choose the region that this is part of. So this is Western Europe. And then you would choose the subregion. So Portugal belongs with Spain, same general vicinity. So, so I would choose 3 as the subregion. And then that item would appear in that particular subregion. So again, I know, you know, the choices that I've made are not necessarily going to make everybody happy, but I hope they'll at least be reasonable enough that you can say, okay, well, this is where I'm going to locate this item that appears on the fringes, or not the fringes, but the edges of the regions is what I mean, as I've defined them.
Can you go over again how you got to the timeline from the info pane?
Sure. So now we'll see, let's do this with, so I just added the info pane. And in fact, let me do this, all right? We're in Genesis 1:1. This is something that I hope will make some of you happy. I searched our user forums for, you know, what are people complaining about the timeline? What are the things that are missing that, you know, they that our users say, hey, why isn't this on the timeline? And most of what I got was, why aren't the antediluvians, Adam and Enoch and so on, that are listed in Genesis, available on the timeline? And the reason that we've always shied away from adding them is, first of all, you know, where exactly do we put them on these regions? Second, you know, to the typical dates of the antediluvians for, you know, that people are familiar with are Bishop Ussher's dates that were done in the 16th century, I think he was, 16th or 17th century. And they're they're not widely accepted by scholars. One of the challenges is they actually overlap with early Egyptian history and Indian history and so on. So we just kind of left them out. Well, I decided, you know what, there's enough demand for it. Let's find a place to put the antediluvians in here. Now, I've taught webinars where I've shown you could create your own user items to add the antediluvians, but why make you do that? So you can see here, we've got just, excuse me, my voice is changing. I'm going to get my driver's license next week. Better take a drink of water to wet my whistle. All right, so here I'm going to click on Adam, and here's Adam. And it's such a long period that it's even trying to zoom in, it's really, really tiny. But we can go zoom in to see Adam and the other antediluvians. Now, where I've got them on the timeline is in the world section. I went ahead and did them in the world region. And I actually kind of did them toward the bottom half of the world region where I have the Americas and Oceania, because both the Americas and Oceania have relatively late historical periods. Most of history is prehistory for those two regions. So I didn't have to worry about Ussher's antediluvian period clashing with, say, the Indus Valley civilization in India. So I just sort of stuck it at the bottom half of the world section. And that way you can kind of see how it intersects with recorded history and how Bishop Ussher dated those particular individuals. So anyway, I hope that makes some of you happy who have wanted that, to at least see the relationships between the antediluvians, even if you don't accept the dates. At least the dates give you a sense of how old one antediluvian was when another was born, and on and on. All right, so so that's an example of using the info pane. It's coming up with Adam because the Adam is listed in Genesis 1 through 3, right? So if I go to, let's go back to First Kings 18, and now we've got Elijah. So if I click on Elijah, and for some reason, I have noticed this, and I need to sort of track it down, that on occasion, I'll get the find doesn't go to the right spot. And so that's a bug we're working on trying to deal with. So I just, at this point, need to scroll down a little bit. There's Elijah in Israel. All right, but it's coming up in the info pane because 1 Kings 18:1 is between 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 2:12, which is the scriptural period of Elijah. All right. Some other, let's kind of dig into, well, are there any more questions before I move on?
Yeah, let's see. From a couple people are curious about whether you include Asian history, China or Japan, for example.
I basically did the Chinese dynasties and added, well, for example, let's do this. Well, let's just scroll up there for right now. So, you know, the original scope that that we came up with was not to do American history and Asian history and so on. But when we added the regions that we did, and I had the world region that we weren't really using, I said, well, at least this will give us a place for East Asian history and Australian history and so on. So I put in the Chinese dynasties because they were relatively easy to add. I've got a few items in East Asia, so Warring States period, Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, Confucius, the canonization of the Tao Te Ching, because it's too hard to figure out when the Tao Te Ching was written. So you can see I've got some events. I've got Alopen, who is an early Nestorian missionary to China, and the Nestorian stela and Nestorian documents are ancient Christian documents in Chinese. Really fascinating stuff. So yeah, I've got some events. But, if I had more time, I'd love to do Korean history. I'd love to do Japanese history and all of that. But I sort of had to draw the line somewhere. So, and let's see. Yeah, I'll have, well, I think for Francis Xavier, if I have him in here, I don't know if I have him in here yet. But I'll probably have him in East Asia because that's I've tended to do missionaries in the area where they have ministered. But yeah, so here, American missionary to Burma. So there's a little bit beyond Chinese history, but it's again, with more time, I could add all kinds of stuff. But I've tried to sort of just give a sketch of some of these other regions that are more remote from biblical history, I guess is the best way to say it. The original kind of scope that we had planned for the new timeline upgrade was, well, we've done biblical history with the original timeline. So a natural extension of that is church history and religious history and so on. But the problem is, how do you isolate that history from the political history and the wider historical context? So, so I've ended up adding a lot more than I had originally sort of planned to add, and could spend the next 3 years adding even more items, but I'm scrambling to try and get the last major gaps filled, and so that I can release this thing, and then we can upgrade it in the future. But again, the goal with dividing the regions the way that we did was to at least give everybody a reasonable place to put items that that we didn't include. That answer the question?
I think so. And a couple of people have been asking if you could show where to get the documentation related to conservative and critical dating schemes.
Oh, sure. So, yeah, the you know what? Let's talk about. Let's do this. There are a lot of different things that in the database that I want to show you. I've tried to cover lots of different kinds of items, and of course, my concern is you always worry that, well, I've covered some areas well, and other areas, there are other things that should have been included that I haven't included, and I'm sure you all will find things like that. But let's look at writings. And I've done a number of things with writings, and this is all leading back to conservative and critical. So, originally writings was biblical writings and related writings to biblical, that shed light on the Bible. So books of the Bible, when they were are believed to have been written, items like the Gezer calendar, early Hebrew inscription, listing the times for various agricultural activities. I think that's been there, but now you get a nice little description of it. So we've got the various books. Let's go to let's see. Let's go to the New Testament, and let's do something like Mark. All right. Well, this one has a description which I'm planning on changing, because I originally thought, well, I'll try to summarize what the book is. The Gospel by Mark, companion of Peter, which emphasizes Jesus's actions, and of course, even that description is a conservative description. Some might say, well, it's not really Mark. Who knows? But what I did instead that I thought would be more helpful with writings is if I click on the conservative button to change to critical, here's the description for Mark in the critical dating scheme. So we get around 70. And I went back to the original source that we used and looked at, well, what were the arguments that they used for the date that they gave, and then I tried to summarize that. So the date that's given here assumes knowledge of the first Jewish revolt. That's why it's around 70, either approaching or recently past. So, and then, if we go to something like, I don't know, let's do Jude. Probably written after James, so around 100, probably written after James, around the turn of the 2nd century. Well, let's do 2nd Esdras and see what we have here. We've added apocryphal or deuterocanonical books now, a composite work from the 2nd or 3rd centuries. Between 100 and 200 AD. So, and then you can see I've got rabbinic materials, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud will be in Mesopotamia, obviously, and so on. So I thought that would be more helpful, because then you'll at least have some basis for understanding why is this book located here. All right, so now to answer your question, if you go into the help, and just go to Accordance Help, and let's just expand that. If you go into the timeline and go into the timeline dates, it'll say understanding conservative versus critical. So this kind of explains the concept of, why did we divide the dates according to conservative and critical, and what do we mean by those terms? We went round and round about what terms to use, and these were the least offensive that we could come up with, and even still, we have conservative scholars going, well, that implies that we're not critical. Critical scholars will say, hey, I'm very conservative on my date of this or that or the other. So we still haven't made everybody happy, but at least we explain here what we mean by those labels. And basically what it boils down to is the conservative system takes the Bible's account of history as essentially reliable at face value. So chronological statements are usually judged as innocent until proven guilty. The critical dating scheme is a little more free to say, you know what, maybe this number that's given is, metaphorical or figurative or mistaken or whatever. So those are kind of the basic outlines between the two schemes. And then we have here timeline date scheme sources. So this will give you the sources for the conservative dates, and then the critical dates. So for the Old Testament, you have Eugene Merrill's Kingdom of Priests. I went back for this upgrade. I went back through Kingdom of Priests and tried to scour for any other sort of datable events that I could add. And then for, say, New Testament writings, Harold Honer's Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, and critical dates. Even our critical dates are on the sort of moderate end of critical. If you get too critical, those guys won't get pinned down about any dates. So even some of these sources are, there are sort of more radical attempts to reconstruct chronology, but these are kind of a good representation of the critical scheme. So, and then other dates, we use the Cambridge Ancient History, Thiel's Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, and so on. So that's where you'll find information about the sources that we use. Now, for all of the post-biblical items that I've added, I used a variety of sources, just kind of cross-checked a bunch of different sources. So I don't know, I can list some of those, but I don't know that I'd even be able to reconstruct all of them. But thankfully, once you get past the Roman Empire, most dates are relatively uncontroversial, although there's still some, some discussion when you get into the nitty-gritty of some of these periods. All right, so that is the sources that we used. All right, so let's see. Do I want to show you anything else with writings? I've got other writings too. Let's go to Europe. Well, here we've got Islamic writings, so the period of the Quran, and then other Islamic sources like the Hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. There should be another one somewhere in here. I think I've got Al-Tabari, one of the early biographers of Muhammad, but it's easier to date the man than the book, and so I think I'd put him as an individual. But here we've got things like papal decrees, the Divine Comedy, the Travels of Marco Polo, and let's go into Europe. So you've got in the Reformation period, you've got the various Reformation confessions or creeds. You've got Luther's translation of the German Bible, and so on. And you've got the Remonstrance. One of the challenges I had in covering the Reformation is so much of the Reformation happens just outside of Germany and France, right? In the Netherlands and in Switzerland and so on. So I kind of split the difference where Switzerland was concerned. And so if it's German-speaking Switzerland, I have those events in Germany. And if it's French-speaking Switzerland, then I have those events in France. That seemed like the most reasonable solution, and even their orientation was kind of in different directions, although sort of, even that's kind of an oversimplification. But I've also got English editions, English translations of the Bible. If I had time, I'd add other language translations, but I did do the English Bible translations, and you can see lots of them in the Americas. Book of Mormon, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Mayflower Compact. There are all kinds of writings that are included in writings. All right, so let's go to all items, and let's look for some items, and just to kind of give you a snapshot of how we've handled certain events and so on. I'm going to do a search for something I didn't know anything about until I started doing this, and that's the ecthesis. And again, my find is off again. It's a strange thing. Sometimes it's on and sometimes it's off. It should be in Asia Minor. Yeah, here it is. The ecthesis. And let me zoom in so you can see that a little better. But so this is an edict of the Emperor Heraclius and Patriarch Sergius, which gave imperial sanction to monothelitism, the view that Christ has two natures but one will. So this is kind of an obscure for most Westerners who, we tend to forget that the Byzantine Empire was still in operation for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, and we kind of, if you come from a Western European American background, Americans were notorious for thinking, that history began with America, right? And that's one nice thing. This will correct that imbalance. If we let's just do prophets so that we can see the whole sweep of history easily. So this is, I'm already zoomed way out, and I'm still not at the beginning of Egyptian history. In fact, most of Egyptian history you can't even see. So if we start at the beginning of recorded history around 3000 BC, American history is way up here, and this is where modern American history begins. So that should give us a sense of hopefully historical perspective and humility, not to think that history began in 1776. But let's go back to all items, and let me go back to the ecthesis. So I'm in Asia around here. And so this is essentially after the various ecumenical councils. And by the way, notice that we have the ecumenical councils: Council of Nicaea, which is regarded as the first ecumenical council, First Council of Constantinople, and you get a description of every one of these and what they were. So Ecumenical Council, which produced the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. Say that 3 times fast. The Synod of the Oak was a little-known synod where John Chrysostom was basically ousted as Archbishop of Constantinople. Council of Chalcedon, and so on. Well, the Council of Chalcedon, Ecumenical Council, which produced the definition of Chalcedon, which affirms that Christ had both a human and divine nature, rejected by Oriental Orthodox churches. So the Eastern churches basically broke with the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine Orthodox Church over the definition of Chalcedon. And then because of that, you had efforts after that to try to come up with some kind of compromise that the Eastern churches could accept, and the ecthesis was one of those. So they sort of kept getting narrower and narrower in their discussions of Christology. So, okay, well, can we say that Christ had two natures, a human and a divine nature, but can we say that his will was not divided and therefore he had one will? Well, the Chalcedonians felt like that was a dangerous step away from the definition of Chalcedon and so on. So we've got all of these kinds of church history events here. But here again, what I want you to see is, you know, not only can I learn about these things by clicking on them and discovering them, I can click to get the report, and I can get everything that's going on. So I can see, let's go to, let's go to Rome. So here, Rome is under the control of the Byzantine Exarchate. This is actually in the wrong place. Honorius I is the Bishop of Rome, or Pope, who was posthumously anathematized for his support of monothelitism. So he actually was willing to sign on to the ecthesis, and he was later condemned for that. Then you have in Anatolia, you have the Byzantine Empire. You have Maximus the Confessor, who was a Byzantine theologian who opposed monothelitism, this idea that Christ has one will, even though he has two natures. And he was actually mutilated for his beliefs and exiled. You have Heraclius, who is the Byzantine emperor at the time, and he's the emperor that is fighting the Persians, and then essentially the empire gets so exhausted fighting the Persians that they become prey for the Muslims. And then here are the patriarchs at the time of this particular edict that is produced. And here's what's going on in Persia and Mesopotamia and so on. So there's a lot of really cool stuff in here that you'll be able to explore. Another, and I've really tried to overcome my Western biases and chronicle the Eastern Church and the various splits that occurred and so on. Let's look at another example. Let's search for the First Crusade. And one of the challenges that dividing the timeline up into all these regions presents is, what do you do when you have an event that happens in more than one region? The First Crusade was called by an Italian Pope who made a tour of France and Europe, and then it was you had Europeans being summoned from all over Europe, and then they go to Asia Minor, pass through Asia Minor, and then down into Syria and Palestine. Well, how do you represent all of that on a timeline where everything's divided according to region? That's kind of the only real downside of this approach to dividing things up. So what I ended up doing was I put the Crusades as a whole in the Italy region, because these were called by popes. So to get the dates for the Crusade as a whole, you can go to Rome. And then if I click my little icon here, I can then see, all right, well, here's what's going on in Western Europe. In the Holy Roman Empire, you have the investiture controversy between the Holy Roman emperors and the popes. That's why the Holy Roman emperors didn't really get involved in the First Crusade. And then you have in the Kingdom of France, you have the various ministers at the time. You have the French Rabbi Rashi, who's known for his commentaries. You have Peter the Hermit, who led the ill-fated People's Crusade, and so on. And then as we get into Asia, I skip Asia. Here are various battles in either the People's Crusade, which kind of branched off from the First Crusade, but was not part of the First Crusade, and then battles of the First Crusade, and so on. The Battle of Dorylaeum, Seljuk Turks ambush the Normans who resist until Frankish forces arrive. And then as we go down into Syria, you have the establishment of Crusader kingdoms, the siege of Antioch, and the county of Edessa is established, and so on. So the individual events are located in their individual regions, but the Crusades as a whole are located in Italy because they're called by the popes. That was the best way I could think to kind of give the best of both worlds. So let's see. I think that I have covered most of the things that I wanted to show you. There's all kinds of stuff in here. Oh, you know what? Let's do one more thing. In writings, let's do Codex Alexandrinus. I could do a lot more with this, but I did the major codices. And so I at least give the dates, rough dates, for the various codices of the New Testament, and sometimes the Septuagint. So here's Codex Alexandrinus, Beza, Sinaiticus. Now, I have them in Britain. And the reason I have them in Britain is because I thought about, I could have located Codex Sinaiticus in either, I guess it would be Egypt, either Egypt or Arabia, because it was discovered in the Sinai Peninsula. But it's not necessarily clear that that's where it was written. And so I ended up deciding, well, you know what, it's safer to locate it where it actually is today. And so these codices are located in Britain. So this is in the British Museum, Cambridge University, British Museum, Oxford Bodleian Library, and so on. If we go to France, I think there are some in, I thought there was, well, that's Spain. Yeah, Codex Claromontanus is located in the Paris National Library, and Codex Ephraimi, and so on. So there are lots of little nuggets like that that you'll find in the timeline. I think you'll be surprised at how much is in there. All right, so any other questions on the timeline upgrade?
Yeah, we have a few. Let's see. Just as you click on a date to get a timeline report, can I click on a region and get a timeline report for history in that region?
Yeah, so if I do, now you can do a political period within the region, not the entire region. So I can't click on the label for Western Europe to get the entire history of Western Europe. That would be pretty overwhelming. I'm not even sure how we would organize that report. But if I were to do something like the Merovingian dynasty, I can do that and get every event on the timeline from 481 to 751. And so this will give me a very broad timeline data report. And, I mean, there are really broad regions as we get into things like, if I went up to, I mean, you could get close to doing a whole history of a region. If I go to ancient East Asia or pre-colonial Oceania, 2300 to 1500, if I were to do this, then I'm going to get a lot of history and quite a long data report. All right. By the way, you can control how much information is viewed in the data report by controlling the regions and the items that you have displayed. So if you want to focus on writings, you can do writings and just do writings. If you want to focus on rulers, I can do rulers. And if I do ancient East Asia, now I'm going to get all of the rulers for these various people or various regions. All right.
Great. Another question. Is there any hope that we'll eventually be able to batch export and import user items?
That you're going to have to talk to the programmers about. I am careful about how much I ask them for, so I didn't ask for that for this upgrade, but there's always hope if there's enough noise about it on the forums and enough requests for it. For batch so you're wanting batch export of user items, right? So if I do all user items, by the way, this is one thing that I've done to try to simplify the addition of user items. Prior to this, if you own the timeline and you look at the item layers that are included with the timeline, we have things like all. Notice I've changed it to all items because in our folly we did all for regions and all for items, and you just had two pop-ups that said all. And one of the things that I've done in my webinars on the timeline is taught people to at least add the word regions and add the word items so that you can distinguish those two pop-ups. But so we've done that now in the pre-included layers. But oh, and by the way, I have if you're absolutely opposed to the Usher antediluvian dates, we have one for all but Usher, and I have a custom list called the Fall of the House of Usher. Little joke there. But one of the things that you'll notice is under all, I now have all items selected as the list of items that are shown. Prior to this, we had no user items selected, so that you would initially, if you chose all, you would see only the accordance items. So what that required was that if you wanted to add a user item, you had to go in and add the user item, and then you had to go in and change your layers to all items so that you'd actually see them. And I thought that was confusing. So what I've done is all items has all items, rulers, all items, profits, just about everything has all items now out of the box, so that all you have to do to add a new user item is to add a new user item. So that's one improvement. The other thing that I've done is, let's go to Israel, and it's around, let's see, around here, although I think I need to do, let's do conservative. So I've added two user items that actually make sense. Prior to now, we had some sort of sample user items, but they were made up kings and things like that. And so I couldn't really include those out of the box in the item layers because they were nonsensical. So I just added two items, an individual and an event, to give users a sample of how to create user items, but that will appear on the timeline and actually seem reasonable. So here are my user items: Balaam and Jael kills Sisera. So what you're asking for is the ability to sort of export all of these user items in a way that you could share them with somebody else and have them import the items. I don't see why we couldn't do it, but as our programmers say, you can do anything with enough time and hassle. It's just a question of whether you guys are squeaky enough wheels. But I'll lobby for it. Other than that, short of that, you can, of course, find your user items file and share that with somebody else, and they can replace their user items with your user items. But of course, if they've created user items, it's not merging yours with theirs, it's just replacing theirs. So I understand why you're asking for that. All right.
Great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, David. Someone's asking if you could show again just how to search for, let's say, David on the timeline.
Okay. You can search for David by clicking the little find button here. And I can type David, and that's going to scroll the list of items to David. So this is David's reign, this is David's life, and so on. So I can just click OK if that's the first one that I want. And again, something threw off where it is. Here we go. So we will get this fixed before we release it. But so here it's found this item for David because that's the one I selected from the list. It hasn't found any other items for David. I've got some ideas for how I'd like to see us improve searching in the future, but right now you can either search for one item at a time from within the time.
I think we lost David's audio.
I think so too. I didn't know if there was me or what.
Sorry, I'm going through some of these.
I was trying to show you
actual questions or not.
Pardon?
Sorry, I'm trying to go through some of these, seeing if they're actual questions or just statements. Let's see. I think there was one though about
while you're looking,
here's one, David.
Let me finish answering the last question.
Sure.
That I got cut off on. So by amplifying, Accordance will find every item that matches that word that I amplified. So it finds David, David life, Samuel anoints David, David's flight from Saul, and so on. And this is actually another improvement in the program. Prior to this, it would only have found the items that began with David. It wouldn't have found David's flight from Saul because I amplified from David. Now it finds David's, and it wouldn't have found Samuel anoints David because David comes at the end of the title. So, for example, we had gotten some complaints about Esther not being on the timeline. Well, Esther was on the timeline, but the only thing that I had that I could really date from my source was that Esther becomes queen. But I actually changed the name of this because it was Xerxes marries Esther. And so you could search for Esther and it wouldn't find it because Esther was at the end. So I tried to change some of those to make them show up in the search list. But and then I've added Esther as an individual too. I'm just kind of estimating maybe 20 years on either side of her becoming queen. So so the searching is improved, and I hope that we'll actually improve it further in the future. But that's a new list of requests, and we'll see if I get my wish on that. I'm like the rest of you; they say no to me as well. All right, next question, Mark.
Could you show again how to measure distances and time on the timeline?
Sure. So let's do from Xerxes to Esther becoming queen. all I'm going to do is hold the Option key down and click and drag from the beginning of Xerxes' reign to around the middle of Esther becoming queen. And so this would have been 7 years into his reign. I think Esther actually says in the 7th year of his reign, that's when Esther becomes queen. So the deliverance of Purim happens in the 12th year of his reign.
And for our Windows using friends, that will be the Alt key.
Right. Thank you. All right. So if we wanted to see, how long is it between Esther and the Battle of Gaugamela, where Darius III is defeated by Alexander the Great. Oops, I'm leaning on the keyboard again. We're talking 148 years between Esther and the coming of Alexander.
A couple people have asked if there's going to be a tutorial for this when it comes out.
There is. I am still, the programmers and I are working out some kinks on tutorial support for the timeline, but I'm working on one. So this tutorial will teach you how to open the accordance timeline, open the library. I'll just do it for me. Choose background, do it for me, double click the timeline, and so on. So yeah, we'll have probably a couple of tutorials on different aspects of the timeline.